Smoke lingered in the air, thick and heavy with the scent of charred earth and broken dreams. Once a bustling city full of life, Ashridge was now a hollow skeleton of its former self, silent, scorched and crawling with the dead. Crumbling buildings groaned beneath the weight of ruin, and cracked roads stretched like veins through a landscape soaked in shadow. But within the devastation something still stirred, something more than the infected, something more than despair. It was the heartbeat of resistance, faint but defiant, beating within a small group of survivors who refused to vanish with the old world. Among them was Elias Grant, a former firefighter turned reluctant leader, whose hands had once carried people from burning buildings and now carried a battered rifle he barely knew how to use. He had lost his crew, his station, even his family, but he had not lost his will to fight. Not yet. The group was holed up in the underground level of an old courthouse, its thick concrete walls a rare refuge against the relentless nightmare above. There were 7 of them, each scarred in a different way by the collapse. Ava, the sharp-eyed nurse who stitched wounds by lantern light. Marcus, a radio technician who still clung to the hope that someone somewhere was listening. Layla and Theo, teenage siblings who had grown up too fast in a world that no longer allowed childhood. And Reese, a grizzled ex-con with a knack for spotting danger before it arrived. The 7th was Nina, a quiet woman with haunted eyes and a secret she had yet to reveal. They called themselves the Ash Guard, not because they believed they could guard the ashes of civilization, but because they refused to let the flames go out completely. On the 5th day, without proper food, Elias gathered the group around the dim light of a flickering lamp. "We can't keep hiding down here," he said. "Supplies are gone. We're getting weaker. If we stay, we die slow. If we move, we might die fast. But we might also find something, someone." His voice cracked slightly, but he pressed on. "Hope didn't die with the cities. We're still breathing. That has to count for something." No one spoke at first. Then Ava looked up, brushing dust from her blood-stained scrubs. "I heard a broadcast last night. From the northern ridge. It was faint, but it was human. They said there's a safe zone, well-guarded, solar-powered, food, medicine, everything. If we reach it, we might stand a chance." Marcus nodded, adjusting his makeshift headset. "I caught the signal too. Just once. But if they're real, it changes everything." The decision was made. They would leave at first light, traveling through the ruined outskirts toward the ridge, a 2-day trek at best, assuming they weren't ambushed, cornered, or infected along the way. The undead, once slow and predictable, had started to adapt. Not with intelligence but with instinct. They moved in packs now, drawn by scent, sound, and movement. Some even climbed. Elias had seen it himself, a half-burned zombie dragging its twisted limbs over a fence with inhuman persistence. That night no one slept much. Reese sharpened a crowbar with steady hands. Theo tied makeshift armor out of scrap metal and rubber. Ava cleaned her few remaining medical tools with trembling fingers. Nina sat apart from the others, staring into the darkness as if it held the answers. Elias sat by the door, listening for movement. Every creak made his heart jump, every gust of wind sounded like a death march. But when dawn finally broke through the filth-covered skylight, it brought with it a strange calm, like the breath before the storm. They emerged one by one, blinking against the pale light of morning. The city was silent, but they all knew better than to trust the quiet. Moving in a tight formation, they began their journey north, weaving through alleys, cutting across open courtyards, avoiding roads where the dead tended to gather. Every shadow could be hiding a predator. Every rooftop could collapse. And yet, there was something in their steps that hadn't been there before: determination, unity, a glimmer of purpose. 2 hours in, they encountered their first threat. A single infected staggered into view, mouth agape, eyes clouded with hunger. But as Elias raised his weapon, more shapes emerged, half a dozen, then a dozen more. It was a trap. The infected had learned to bait. "Run!" Elias shouted, but they were already surrounded. Back against a half-destroyed diner, the group formed a defensive circle. Metal clanged. Screams echoed. Blood sprayed, not human, not yet. They fought with every ounce of strength left in them, not for survival alone, but for something greater, for the spark of hope that still smoldered in the ashes of the old world. And hope, they vowed, would not burn out so easily. The scent of rot clung to everything. As the Ashguard moved through the crumbling outskirts of Ashridge, the city loomed like a dying beast, its silence more dangerous than its growl. Rubble lined the streets, windows shattered like old bones, and cars sat frozen mid-escape, long since stripped and abandoned. Elias led the group, every step calculated, every movement quiet. Behind him, the others moved in a staggered line, heads on a swivel, weapons gripped tight. No one spoke. In this world, sound was a signal, of life or of death. They kept to narrow alleyways and broken side streets. Ava scanned rooftops with a scavenged pair of binoculars. Marcus clutched his radio equipment in a tightly wrapped canvas bag, ears twitching every few minutes to check for signals. Layla held Theo's hand with a firm grip, acting more like his guardian than older sister. Reese brought up the rear, crowbar ready, his sharp eyes catching the flicker of movement others missed. Nina remained mostly silent, her hand wrapped tightly around a long, slender blade fashioned from a curtain rod. She rarely looked anyone in the eye. As midday approached, they reached a burnt-out school bus blocking the road. "We'll have to climb over," Elias said quietly. He hoisted himself up first, then reached down to help Layla and Theo. But halfway across, Reese halted. "Wait," he growled, sniffing the air. A faint gurgle, almost inaudible, drifted from beneath the bus. Then a low growl. Elias turned just in time to see a decaying hand shoot out from the shadows, grabbing Ava's ankle. She screamed, stumbling backward. The creature, a half-burned child zombie in a torn school uniform, emerged, eyes blank, jaw snapping. Before anyone else could react, Nina lunged. Her blade struck once, swift and brutal, silencing the infected permanently. Ava was unharmed but shaken. "They're starting to hide now," Marcus muttered. "They're learning." They continued, pace quicker now, nerves sharper. Each corner was a test of patience and fear. They passed a collapsed church, its bell tower buried in the street. Graffiti scrawled across a nearby wall read, "The dead don't forgive." Theo asked softly, "Why would someone write that?" No one had an answer. Later they reached what used to be a grocery store. Its front had been smashed in, the shelves looted, but Elias waved them in. "We need rest." 20 minutes. Inside they found half-crushed boxes of canned goods, a few moldy snacks, and a mostly intact first-aid kit. Ava pocketed the bandages and antiseptic like gold. Layla found 2 cans of peaches, rare treasure, and split one with her brother. But the moment of peace didn't last. Marcus, still fiddling with his radio gear near a shattered freezer, froze. "I'm picking something up," he whispered. Everyone crowded around. Static, then faint beeping, then clearer than ever. "Northern Ridge. Safe. Repeat. Survivors welcome." The voice was faint but undeniably human. Elias looked to the others. "It's real," he said. "The broadcast. There's something out there." Before they could celebrate, a crash echoed from the rear of the store. Reese swung around, crowbar raised. "We've got company." From the shadows they came, 3 no for infected, crawling over broken glass like predators. One wore the uniform of a store manager, face half missing. Another had a broken arm dragging behind it like dead weight. They had smelled the peaches. The group scattered into positions they'd rehearsed countless times. Layla shielding Theo, Ava backing up with a pipe raised, Elias stepping forward with shaking hands on his rifle. 2 shots rang out. 1 infected dropped. Reese took another down with a vicious swing. Nina flanked the last 2 from behind, moving like a shadow, blades flashing. In less than 20 seconds it was over. But the noise would draw more. "We have to move," Elias ordered. "Now." They sprinted from the store back into the maze of concrete and dust. They didn't stop until they reached the shell of a library 2 blocks away. Inside, the heavy double doors were reinforced with bookshelves, offering a brief chance to catch their breath. Marcus wiped sweat from his forehead. "That transmission, it's repeating. Every 2 hours. Same voice, same words. It's on a loop, but it means someone's out there." Elias looked around the group, tired, dirty, scared, but alive. "Then that's where we're going," he said. "No matter what." Nina finally spoke. Her voice was soft but steady. "The dead are watching. But they don't own us. Not yet." That night, they took turns on watch, huddled in a circle surrounded by the ashes of old stories and forgotten knowledge. Outside, the wind howled through the ruins. Somewhere nearby, a low groan echoed. But inside the library, 7 survivors clung to a single truth. Hope hadn't died. It had simply gone quiet. And now it was starting to speak again. Morning broke with an eerie orange hue leaking through the dusty glass windows of the ruined library. The Ashguard awoke stiff, sore, but alert, every hour of rest stolen from a world that no longer offered peace. Elias stood quietly by the boarded entrance, watching the sun rise over the remains of a city still groaning under its own death. They had no illusions left. Survival wasn't a right, it was a constant battle against fear, fatigue, and the infected who never truly slept. Their next objective was the river. If they could cross it, they'd be clear of the downtown ruins and one step closer to the northern ridge. Ava had spotted a damaged footbridge on an old city map, and Marcus had confirmed the radio signal grew marginally stronger in that direction. But it wouldn't be easy. The district between them and the bridge had once been a shopping and transit hub. Now it was a hotspot for roaming hordes. They moved out in 2 lines, Reese and Elias at the front, Nina and Ava flanking the back. The siblings, Layla and Theo, kept to the center. The ruins felt tighter here, with half-collapsed buildings leaning into the streets, casting long shadows that twisted with the wind. Everything echoed, footsteps, shifting rubble, even breath. And the quiet felt wrong. Too clean. Half an hour in, they reached a narrow alleyway blocked by a delivery truck. "We climb," Elias said softly. He boosted Layla up first, then Theo. As the rest of the group followed, Ava suddenly froze at the top of the truck's hood. Her eyes widened. "Don't move." Everyone stopped. At the far end of the alley, just barely visible in the gloom, were figures, shambling but not aimless. A dozen, maybe more. They weren't wandering. They were waiting. Watching. Trap. Reese whispered. Elias scanned the alley. "Looks like it." Suddenly Marcus shouted. "Behind us." More infected were pouring in from the opposite side, drawn by the noise of movement or maybe the scent of warm flesh. The group was boxed in. Panic rippled for a moment, but Elias snapped them back to focus. "Everyone, up and over." Rooftop. They scrambled onto the truck and leapt to a nearby fire escape. Reese hauled Theo up with brute force, while Ava yanked Layla by the arm. Elias and Nina took the rear, fighting off a reaching infected with quick strikes before following the others upward. Just as Elias climbed over the last rung, the infected slammed into the lower ladder, snarling and clawing. The rooftop was barely stable. Rusted beams and broken vents surrounded them. Below, the alley was now full of infected pressing against walls and trying to climb. Marcus looked over the edge, pale. They didn't just wander here. That was coordinated. They led us into that alley. Elias caught his breath. They're baiting us more and more. It's not intelligence, but it's some kind of memory. Patterns. Or they're watching us learn and just copying, Ava added grimly. They kept moving, leaping rooftop to rooftop until they reached the edge of a parking garage that overlooked the river. From here they could see the bridge, narrow, rusted, barely holding itself together. But it was intact. "Let's move," Elias ordered, but as they started down the garage ramp, Theo stopped. He was pointing. Down below near the bridge stood 3 people, armed, alert, alive. Survivors. A rush of hope swept the group. But it was brief. One of the strangers raised a flare gun and fired. Not at them. Into the sky. A trap. Within seconds, the sound of groans swelled behind them. Infected were closing in fast. Elias grabbed Theo and shouted, "Back! We're not safe." But the strangers had seen them now. One of them, a tall man with a rifle, yelled something they couldn't make out. Then he fired. Not at the infected. At Elias. The bullet clipped his shoulder, spinning him to the ground. Chaos broke out. Nina dragged Elias behind cover. Reese fired blindly toward the strangers. Ava pulled Theo and Layla down a ramp to the next level. Marcus hurled a bottle to draw the infected away, then followed. Pinned down, Elias gritted his teeth in pain. Why are they shooting? Nina's face was cold. Because hope makes people desperate. Together they retreated through the structure, ducking gunfire and dodging infected now flooding the lower floors. In the confusion, the strangers backed off, possibly thinking the horde would finish the job. But the Ashguard wasn't done. They escaped through a utility tunnel at the garage's base, bleeding, limping, but alive. They found shelter in a nearby maintenance shed, and Ava got to work on Elias's shoulder. "Friendly survivors," Marcus said bitterly. "Guess that was too much to hope for." "Hope doesn't mean trusting everyone," Elias muttered. "It means surviving long enough to find the ones worth trusting." Outside, the sounds of the infected drifted away again. The flare's smoke still lingered in the sky. And the Ashguard knew this truth now. Not all dangers were dead. Some were still very much alive, and far worse than the infected. Ask ChatGPT. The sky had turned a bruised gray by the time the Ashguard regrouped in the maintenance shed, deep in the industrial ruins beyond the city center. Thunder rolled low on the horizon, but no rain fell, only tension. Elias sat propped against the wall, his shoulder wrapped in gauze soaked with antiseptic and sweat. Ava had done her best, but she couldn't remove the bullet. It was lodged deep, and any mistake could cost him his arm, or his life. Despite the pain, Elias's jaw stayed clenched, eyes focused. He wasn't done yet. None of them were. Layla and Theo sat huddled together, whispering about the gunman at the bridge. Marcus tried once again to boost the fading radio signal. Nina stood by the door like a statue, blade in hand, unmoving. Reese paced, eyes burning with quiet fury. People, he muttered. Always thought it'd be the dead we'd have to watch out for. Turns out, the ones breathing are worse. They fired first, Ava said, still kneeling beside Elias. No warning. No negotiation. They just wanted us dead. Territory, Elias rasped. They were guarding it. Maybe using the flare to draw infected. Maybe they lure people in, then take what they need. Nina finally spoke. That wasn't their first time doing that. The silence in the shed grew heavier. Marcus broke it. So what now? We can't go back. The infected are swarming the entire garage. We can't move forward, unless you want to try sneaking past the bridge killers in daylight. No, Elias said, voice steady despite the pain. We go around. Through the train yard. Everyone looked at him. That place is crawling, Reese replied. It is, Elias admitted. But they won't expect us to go there. And if we time it right, use the shadows, use the storm, we might make it to the far side of the river without running into them. It's madness, Ava whispered. But it's a plan, Nina countered. At nightfall, with the storm rumbling closer, they made their move. The train yard was a graveyard of rusted locomotives and derailed cargo cars, blanketed in weeds and silence. The group moved low and fast between old boxcars, their eyes darting in every direction. The air smelled like metal and mildew, and something fouler that none of them wanted to identify. Halfway through, a distant whistle echoed, a long, hollow sound. Theo froze. What was that? Warning, Elias hissed. They're tracking us. In the shadows ahead, movement, 3 silhouettes weaving between train cars. Not infected. Human. They followed us? Ava asked, crouching. No, Nina replied coldly. They hunted us. Shots cracked through the yard. Bullets slammed into rusted metal, pinging dangerously close. Down? Elias shouted. The group split, diving for cover behind old wheels and crates. Reese returned fire with a scavenged handgun, giving them precious seconds to reposition. Marcus hurled another glass bottle, its shattering sound echoing off the steel maze and drawing several distant groans, infected responding to the noise. Let them come, Reese growled, firing again. Let the dead feast on the ones who betrayed the living. Chaos erupted. The infected began pouring in from the far side of the yard, drawn by gunfire and sound. The strangers, caught between the ash guard and the swarm, began to panic. One of them ran too far into the open and was immediately tackled by 3 infected. The others retreated toward the southern fence, firing wildly. Elias signaled the team. Go. Now. They ran. Vaulting crates, ducking through open train cars, the ash guard pushed toward the far edge of the yard where a narrow maintenance catwalk led over the river. The bridge wasn't sturdy, it swayed in the wind and creaked under pressure, but it was their only shot. Ava helped Elias across first. Layla and Theo followed, clinging to the rails as the storm finally broke overhead, sending sheets of rain down on the rusted metal. Reese brought up the rear, pausing only to plant a rigged can of fuel and glass, Marcus's last explosive distraction, on the edge of the platform. As the bridge collapsed behind them in a burst of flame and thunder, the infected swarmed the fire and the gunmen, what remained of them, disappeared into the smoke. Soaked, exhausted, and bruised, the group collapsed beneath an overhang on the other side of the river. Their hearts still pounded. Their eyes still scanned the darkness. But for now they were safe. Elias looked up at the group. We're not just fighting the dead anymore. We're fighting what the world turned people into. Nina nodded. Then we fight smarter. Lightning flashed behind her, illuminating the broken skyline they had just escaped. They had crossed a river of death. And what waited ahead was still unknown. But one thing was clear, the fire in them, the hope, was still burning. Ask ChatGPT. Dawn filtered weakly through the trees as the ash guard moved into the outskirts of the forest. The rain had stopped hours earlier, leaving behind a damp chill that clung to their clothes and made their steps heavier. The once civilized world had vanished behind them, swallowed by ruin and rot. Now only the forest stood between them and the mountains beyond, the place where the radio signal originated. If the message was true, if the safe zone was real, then they were closing in on the first true sign of hope since the world had fallen apart. But the forest was not empty. It stretched for miles, dense with twisted trees and overgrowth reclaiming the land. Nature had taken back what the city had lost. Birds no longer sang. No insects buzzed. Only the sound of boots crunching wet leaves and the distant moans of the undead ever broke the silence. And even that quiet felt wrong. "We stay low," Elias whispered, wincing slightly from the wound in his shoulder, now tightly bound and freshly cleaned by Ava's limited supplies. "Avoid open paths. If you hear anything that sounds like it's watching, don't run. Just hide." Theo looked up. "Do you think they're different in here? The zombies?" "They adapt," Marcus said, checking his radio. "And if no one's come through these woods in a while, they might have gotten wild." Hours passed as they crept through the undergrowth. The canopy above cast eerie patterns of light and shadow, and fallen branches created natural barriers at every turn. The group navigated with quiet discipline, Layla scouting ahead, Reese watching their flank, Nina moving with such silence she nearly disappeared into the trees. Then they found the signs. First, it was a stripped backpack hanging from a low branch, torn and faded. Then, a trail of old blood leading into a ravine. Farther in, they stumbled upon an old military tent, collapsed and overgrown but clearly once inhabited. Reese crouched beside it, examining the torn fabric. Abandoned fast. No gear. No sign of struggle. They either ran, or they didn't get a chance to. "Do you hear that?" Ava suddenly asked. Everyone froze. At first it seemed like nothing, just the rustling of leaves. But then it grew clearer, soft footsteps, far too many to count, circling them in the brush. They couldn't see anything, but the presence was undeniable. They were surrounded. "Eyes up," Elias hissed. "Weapons ready." The groan came next, long, deep, and close. One by one, the infected stepped out from between the trees, emerging slowly as if testing the air. These weren't like the ones in the city. Their eyes were duller, their movements slower, but there was something unsettling in the way they moved, almost in sync like a pack. "Back to the ridge," Nina said softly. "Don't shoot unless you have to." They moved carefully, but it wasn't fast enough. One of the infected, a tall, skeletal man with bark embedded in his rotting skin, lunged. Reese tackled him, crushing his skull with the crowbar, but the sound echoed through the trees like a dinner bell. The others rushed forward, shrieking now. "Go. Run." Elias shouted. The Ashguard broke into a sprint, dodging trees, leaping over roots, slipping through the muddy terrain. Behind them, the forest exploded with movement. It wasn't just a dozen. It was dozens, possibly more. Ava pulled Theo forward, shouting for him to keep going. Layla doubled back to grab Marcus, who had fallen trying to protect his radio. Reese covered the rear, shouting directions as he fought to slow the swarm. Nina moved like a shadow, slashing anything that got too close. They finally reached a narrow gorge with a half-rotted footbridge stretching across it. No time to think. They ran. One by one, the bridge creaked beneath their weight. The undead were close behind. Elias crossed last, his steps staggering. Halfway across, the bridge snapped with a sickening crack. He fell to his knees, grabbed the railing, and pushed forward with everything he had left. Just as the last plank gave way, Reese caught his arm and hauled him across. The infected reached the edge but didn't cross. They stood there, staring, swaying slowly in unison. Then, without a sound, they backed away, disappearing into the trees as if melting into the shadows. No one spoke for a long time. The forest behind them was once again silent. "What was that?" Layla finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "They weren't hunting us like before," Marcus murmured. "It was more like hurting. Like they were trying to push us somewhere." Elias looked up toward the mountain trail ahead. "Then we better find out where they want us to go, and make sure we get there first." They had escaped the city. They had escaped betrayal. But in the forest, they had stepped into something older, stranger. And the real war was just beginning. Ask ChatGPT. The Ashguard moved cautiously along the narrow path that wound upward into the mountains, the forest finally thinning behind them. The climb was steep and treacherous, but it was the only route that matched the direction of the mysterious radio broadcast. With every step, the air grew colder, sharper. Trees gave way to jagged rocks and open slopes, where the wind howled like voices trapped in the cliffs. Down below, the forest slept in uneasy silence, and behind them, the ruins of Ashridge were long out of view. They were higher than they had ever been since the collapse, and the higher they went, the more they felt watched. Elias walked with a limp, his shoulders stiff and swollen under fresh wrappings. Ava checked the wound twice a day now, her supplies dwindling fast. Reese stayed close, constantly scanning the ridgelines, crowbar ever ready. Marcus held the radio like a lifeline, fine-tuning the frequency every few hours. It still repeated the same words: Northern Ridge. Safe zone. Survivors welcome. But now there was something new, a faint clicking behind the message. A coded signal. A pattern. Nina was the first to notice the stone markers. They were set into the cliffs, spaced every 100 feet or so. Stacked rocks, unnatural in shape and formation, marked with faint symbols scratched into the surface. Someone placed these, she said, crouching beside one. Not recently, but deliberately. Trail markers? Asked Layla. Warnings, Nina replied. I've seen things like this before. In places where people didn't come back. Despite the unease, the group pressed on. The trail twisted along the edge of a cliff, the drop so sheer that Theo couldn't look down without his knees shaking. On the far side of the valley, the remains of a broken tower jutted from the mountain like a skeletal finger pointing skyward. And just beyond that, nestled in a hollow of stone and mist, they saw it, a small fortified outpost built into the mountainside. That's it, Marcus breathed. That's where the signal's coming from. The group paused, excitement clashing with caution. It looked real, walls reinforced with scrap metal and solar panels glinting in the gray light. Smoke curled from a chimney. A watchtower stood silent but sturdy. But the silence was unsettling. No guards. Ava asked. Not even a bird in the sky, Reese muttered. I don't like it. Still, they approached carefully, following a gravel path toward the gate. As they neared, a voice crackled from a hidden speaker. Identify yourselves. Everyone froze. Elias stepped forward. We're survivors from the southern ruins. Ashridge. We followed your broadcast. We mean no harm. Static answered first. Then the gate creaked open. A single man stood behind it. Mid-40s, clean-shaven, wearing a patched uniform and a pistol on his hip. He gave a curt nod. Come inside. Slowly. Inside the outpost it was quiet. Too quiet. There were no other people. Just scattered supplies, empty bunks, and a strange tension in the air. The man introduced himself as Captain Thorne, claiming he was part of an early response unit that had maintained the relay after the fall. We held this post as long as we could, he said. The rest didn't make it. Elias studied him carefully. And the broadcast? Thorne looked away. On a loop. It was meant to give people hope. We didn't think anyone would actually reach us. That answer didn't sit right. Neither did the way his eyes never stayed on the same person for long. Marcus kept scanning the area with quiet suspicion. Where are your supplies? He asked. Where's your backup power? This place is too well kept to be abandoned. Thorne hesitated. We ration. We survive. But the Ashguard knew better. That night they stayed in a secured room, supposedly for their protection. But Nina disabled the electronic lock the moment Thorne walked away. He's lying, she said. He's hiding something, and we need to find out what before we end up like the rest of his team. They split into pairs and searched the outpost in secret. Layla and Theo discovered a medical room, stocked, organized, but untouched. Reese and Ava found a bunker-level entrance sealed tight with an electronic keypad. Marcus tapped into the system using a salvaged panel, and with a crackle, the door clicked open. What they found inside froze them all. Beneath the outpost was a lab, sterile, cold, and humming with faint power. Vials and tanks lined the walls, many shattered. A wall of photographs showed test subjects. Some had names. Others were only numbers. And scribbled across the far wall were the words, Control through decay. Weaponize the infected. This wasn't just a shelter, Elias whispered. It was an experiment. Above them the speakers crackled again. Thorne's voice returned, calm, cold. You shouldn't have seen that. Then the alarms began to sound. And all hope of rest was replaced by one thing. Skip. Ask ChatGPT. The sirens screamed through the outpost like mechanical howls, echoing off cold walls and shaking loose years of silence. Red warning lights pulsed overhead as the Ashguards scattered from the underground lab, their boots slapping against the metal floors. The secrets they had uncovered clung to them like smoke, proof that this so-called safe zone was never meant to shelter survivors, but to study the infected. Weaponize them. Control them. They had been lured into a trap. We have to get out, now? Elias barked, his voice tight with pain as he clutched his wounded shoulder. Ava steadied him as the group pushed back through the corridors, retracing their steps. Behind them, a heavy blast door slammed shut with a deafening clang, cutting off their escape route. They were being funneled. Thorne's locking us in, Nina growled. He's not just some leftover soldier. He's part of all this. Reese slammed his fist against the wall. This whole place is a lab in disguise. They were playing God, and we walked right into it. Marcus, eyes darting, studied the flashing panels on the walls. There's another way out, there has to be. Labs like this always have emergency tunnels. If we can get back to the control hub, I can access the schematics. Shots rang out in the corridor ahead. Everyone dropped low, ducking behind overturned crates and storage shelves. Thorn's voice echoed over the speaker system, calm and distant. You should have stayed in your room. You had your chance. Now you've seen too much. From the shadows ahead, armed men emerged, 3 of them each wearing outdated military gear and gas masks. These weren't scavengers. They were operators. Trained. Silent. They're not infected, Layla whispered wide-eyed. They're human. Worse, Nina replied. They're the ones who feed the infection. Reese didn't wait. With a snarl, he burst from cover and charged, crowbar swinging. The clash was immediate, gunfire, fists, shouts. Elias fired one-handed, his aim shaky but true. Ava pulled Theo and Layla to cover while Marcus and Nina flanked wide, using the blinking lights as camouflage. The fight was vicious and fast. 2 of Thorn's men went down. The third tried to retreat but was caught by a tripwire Marcus had laid. Silence followed, brief, deadly. We're running out of time, Elias gasped. Marcus, those schematics. Marcus found the control hub, a half-smashed workstation surrounded by outdated tech. Sparks hissed from a damaged monitor, but the emergency backup still glowed faintly. He hacked quickly, his fingers dancing across the keys. There. Service tunnels. Underground. They lead past the perimeter. Ava studied the map. Through sublevel 4. But it's where they kept the most volatile test subjects. Nina nodded. Then we move fast. No mistakes. The tunnels were worse than expected. Narrow, rusted, lined with sealed doors behind which things moved and groaned. The air was thick, heavy with rot and chemical traces. They passed cages bent from the inside, blood trails dried into the floor, shattered observation windows. The remnants of the lab's sins. What were they doing down here? Theo whispered. Layla pulled him closer. Trying to make monsters out of monsters. Suddenly the lights died. Total darkness. Ava grabbed her flashlight but the beam barely cut through the pitch. Something scraped along the far end of the corridor. Then, it screamed. A twisted form lunged from a broken chamber, faster than any infected they'd seen, longer limbs, eyes glowing faintly, mouth stitched from past experiments. It wasn't just infected. It was altered. Controlled once. Now loose. The group scattered. Reese tackled the creature mid-charge, but it threw him across the hall like a rag doll. Nina sliced at its legs, slowing it down. Marcus rigged a shock trap using exposed wires, and with a burst of sparks, the creature convulsed violently and collapsed, twitching before finally going still. Breathing hard, the group continued. No more words were exchanged. They knew now, this place had crossed every line. This wasn't survival anymore. It was war. At last, the tunnel opened into a narrow fissure beyond the mountain. Wind howled through the crack and distant light revealed an exit just ahead. Freedom. As they stepped into the open air, the first sunlight in hours bathed their bruised faces. The cold mountain air stung, but it was real. Cling. Then came the voice. You've escaped the lab. But you're carrying something with you. Thorn. They turned. High on a cliffside speaker, his voice echoed across the rocks. We've learned what we needed. You'll lead others to us. And when they come, we'll be ready. Then the speaker died. For a long time no one spoke. Then Elias, despite his exhaustion, smiled grimly. Let him watch. Let him wait. He thinks he's playing the long game. He looked out toward the wilderness ahead. But we're done hiding. Now we fight back. And with that, the Ashguard disappeared into the wild, wounded but burning with purpose. Because hope wasn't something you waited for. It was something you fought for. Ask ChatGPT. The world beyond the mountain was colder, quieter, but far from safe. The Ashguard descended into a valley shrouded in low mist, its trees twisted and blackened by fire long extinguished. They had escaped the laboratory fortress, uncovered the truth about Thorn's operation, and survived both the infected and those who sought to weaponize them. But survival was no longer enough. The lie of the safe zone had been burned into their minds, and something had changed within each of them. They were no longer just survivors. They were witnesses, fighters, and soon they would become a symbol. They traveled for days along forgotten paths and dried-out riverbeds, staying low, always moving. Elias's wound festered for a time, but Ava's skill and stubbornness kept infection at bay. Reese, battered and bruised, never stopped scanning the horizon, always one step ahead of danger. Marcus kept monitoring the radio frequencies, tracking not just Thorn's signal, but others too. Whispers of survivor camps, scattered pockets of resistance. Places where people were holding on. "We're not alone out here," he said one night, huddled by a small fire beneath a collapsed water tower. "There are more like us. Not many. But enough." Elias stared into the flames, his voice low. "Then we give them something to believe in." That idea, hope as a weapon, began to take root. Days later, they reached a small settlement buried in the hills. Rusted trailers, scrap-built fences, and terrified faces peering from behind boarded windows. The people there were sick, starved, and scared. Thorn's men had passed through weeks earlier, promising shelter in exchange for volunteers. None had returned. The Ashguard didn't hesitate. That night, Nina led a silent strike on the nearby outpost where Thorn's scouts had been stationed. They took down 2 sentries, sabotaged their communications, and left a message carved into a broken radio tower: "We are not your test subjects. We are the fire you thought was ashes." Word began to spread. Through Marcus's broadcasts, survivors learned the truth about the lab in the mountains, about Thorn's lies, and about the group that had taken a stand. People started referring to them by a name that had once been said half in jest, the Ashguard, but now echoed with new purpose. More camps reached out. Some were hesitant, others desperate. And so the Ashguard began building something greater than survival. A network. Scattered, mobile, and hidden, but connected by shared purpose. They taught others how to detect manipulated signals. How to fight smarter. How to recognize the signs of betrayal hidden behind the mask of rescue. But Thorn wasn't finished. In a recorded broadcast hijacking the emergency bands, his voice returned, calm, composed, venom wrapped in velvet. "You run. You rebel. But you carry the very thing you fight against. You are infected with the idea that resistance means victory. It doesn't. It means delay. Delay of the inevitable." His message ended with a threat: "Return what you took, or others will suffer for your defiance." Reese spat on the ground. "Let him come. We're not the same people we were when we crawled through that city." And they weren't. Layla, once a frightened teenager, now trained others in stealth and evasion. Theo, growing into his courage, became a symbol of what this world could still nurture. Innocence protected, not broken. Ava worked tirelessly, not just as a medic but as a leader. Nina, though silent as ever, had become a myth in whispered tales, the blade in the shadows. And Marcus's voice over the radio was no longer one of searching, but of guiding. Elias, still healing, stood tall among them, not just as the man who had led them out of ruin, but as the one who had reminded them that fire still lived beneath the ashes. When Thorn's soldiers came again, 50 of them heavily armed and armored, the Ashguard was ready. Using traps, diversion tactics, and local survivors armed with fresh determination, they turned a peaceful valley into a battleground. They didn't face the enemy head-on. They bled them from the edges, turned their own tech against them, and dismantled their arrogance piece by piece. When the smoke cleared, Thorn's men were gone. And the valley still stood. That night, dozens of survivors gathered beneath the stars to listen as Marcus transmitted a new message across every available frequency. To those still holding on, you are not forgotten. You are not alone. The dead do not own the earth. We are the Ashguard. And this is not the end, it's the beginning. Elias stood beside him, watching the flames dance in the wind. Hope had once been a flicker. Now it was a wildfire. From the ruins of cities. From the shadows of betrayal. From the heart of the infected world. Hope rose again. And it carried a name. The Ashguard. Ask ChatGPT.